Hello. Today I wanted to talk about some of my favorite moments in books. It's not an exhaustive list of the books I've read because that would be exhaustive, but there's some of my favorites. So let's get into it. I suppose the first author to talk about is Sanderson, since I've read so very much of him. But I don't really want to try to pick through all of Sanderson's books because that would also be exhaustive. So let's just talk about a couple things. Generally, my favorite moments in a Sanderson book are what I tend to think of as the calm before the storm. Basically, every time Kaladin makes a new oath, or when Vin goes to confront the Emperor. Although there is one favorite moment in the Final Empire that I particularly like, just because I was able to piece together what Sanderson was setting up for everyone, and that's the moment when they are discussing the plan for the first time, trying to figure out what a good distraction would be. And when Vin suggests that they use the Pits of Hassan. I love this moment because it was one of the times where I felt like I was really in sync with what the author was trying to set up. Because just before that moment, I had figured out what Vin was going to suggest. And it was just a very fun moment. The next set of books I wanted to talk about is by another of my favorite authors, Nix. He isn't as well known as Sanderson, though he is still quite successful. And my favorite series from him is the Aborsen series. Now, I don't consider Lirael, which is a prequel, to really be part of the series, even if it's part of the same world. I haven't read it. I might someday. I just have no real inclination to read it. So let's start with Sabriel. Sabriel is probably my least favorite of the 4 books in the series. Not because of the writing or anything, I just connect with it less. In some ways, Sabriel is almost a prequel in its own right because the other 3 books are all following her sister. But this was the first in the original trilogy before it was expanded. So let's talk about it. There's not a lot of favorite moments. It's just a generally really solid book. But I think the one that I like the most is when she's waiting for her father to show up at school and his dead servant arrives to give her his tools. It gives us a really good view into the magic. We've of course seen a little bit of that previously with her reviving the rabbit, but it gives us both a good view into the magic and the character. Before we saw she was just a serious student and knew that there was some magic. If you read the prologue, you know a little bit more, but this is our first in-depth look into the charter and how this magic system works. And that's generally why I like it. It just introduces us to a very fun and unique magic system and gives us more depth of this character that we've only seen as Sirius so far. Moving on from that, we get to the sequel, which occurs some 16 or 17 years later, and that is Lirael. Now, like I said, this book and the subsequent entries in the series are a little different from the first in that they follow primarily the Lirael character and to a somewhat lesser degree, her nephew Samith, who is maybe a couple years younger than her. They're basically the same age, though. And I just liked this book so much more than the first. And it was really hard to figure out what might be my favorite moment in it. So I'm kind of cheating. I guess my favorite moment is really when she becomes a librarian. This is spread out over a few chapters, which is why I say it's kind of cheating. But when she becomes a librarian and how Nyx reimagined what it is to be a librarian in this magical society, in this community of seers, was very fun. Seeing the character throw herself into the magic system, the broader magic system, instead of her family's more niche subset of it, was very satisfying. Because she's very upset that she isn't a seer, and we get to see her growth as a proper charter mage and learn that she's quite powerful at that. Much more so than her myriad cousins in the mountain. After that, we move directly into Aborsen, the third book in the series. Unlike the massive time jump we got between the first and second books, this book picks up immediately after. Maybe a couple days after the second book ended, this one picks up. And I like this book less than the second book, even though it was still quite good. That made it a little easier to pick out a favorite moment, honestly. And I think that moment was when the disreputable dog revealed herself as Kibeth. We had seen a lot of hints before then, like at Highbridge when the dog made the archer walk, that hinted at her being Kibeth. But that moment at the end of the book where she revealed herself as one of the creators of the charter was just not necessarily surprising, because like I said, it was pretty heavily foreshadowed, but I liked it a lot. It added a nice moment of levity to such a serious situation where they took a break from everyone trying not to panic because the world's literally about to be destroyed, to exclaim over the revelation. So the next book is a little odd. Nyx took a bit of a break from this series, which is to say, I think a couple decades. I'd have to check, but it was quite the break. That was a standalone trilogy, and it appeared to be done. But apparently he got the itch to explore that world again, and came up with 2 new books. The first I mentioned a little earlier is Lirael, and it's a prequel that takes place several hundred years before the events of the main series. I just haven't had the interest in reading it, so I clearly don't have a favorite moment there. But then he wrote Goldenhand. And Goldenhand is a pretty direct sequel to Aborsen. It takes place several months after the events of that trilogy, but it also kind of changes the way I structure the books in my head. Because originally, you had the 3 books and they were the trilogy. But now you have Lirael, which is a pretty far back prequel, Sabriel, which is out of place to the other 3, and kind of functions as a prequel in its own right now. And then you have Lirael, Aborsen, and Goldenhand, which is effectively its own trilogy now, because it all follows the same person and is in a reasonably tight time span. And Goldenhand was a good book. I liked it a lot more than Aborsen. You see Nyx's old problem of insta-love, which is not unique to this series. He doesn't like to waste his time on the romantic subplot. His characters fall in love, and they stay in love, and they get their happily ever after. I don't really mind the happily ever after, but the insta-love kind of irks me, and I just accept it as something one of my favorite authors does and have to move on from there. But my favorite moment is pretty early in the book, when Lirael goes back to the mountain, back to the Clare community, and to try to unravel mysteries. And she's denied entry because her companion is deeply tainted with free magic, which is the bad kind of magic in this world. And the magical guardians of the Clare Mountain deny him entry. And we see this beautiful moment where Lirael is basically forced to stand up for herself and force the rangers, the guards of the mountain, to fetch their boss and let her in. And it's a really great moment because you see her growth. This is a character who is very shy, being brought back to the place of her upbringing where she'd be most likely to follow the lead of her elders and let them make the decisions. And you get to see her growth where she forces them to listen to her, forces them to do what she wants, because what she wants is for the better of everyone, and she gets her way. And it's just a great moment of growth for the character. We really see how she's become the Aborsen in waiting now, not just the second assistant librarian from the Claire's library. Moving on from that, I want to talk about a little bit of an odd one, but it's also one of my favorite books that I always go back and reread once or twice every year or two, which is Lightning. So, Lightning, in spite of the fact that it breaks its own paradox rule, so much that it's not a rule, it's, well, to borrow from pirates, a suggestion. Because in the world of Lightning, you can affect your future, but you can't affect your own past. Because that creates a paradox in this universe that just the universe won't allow. And they break that rule constantly. But ignoring that, it's still a really good book. And my favorite moment from that book was when the protagonist, Laura, learns to fight for herself. Up until that point, she had relied on her time-traveling Nazi guardian to save her from bad things. But this event, her guardian angel didn't come, and she had to protect herself. And this is where she learned that she can't expect someone to stand up for her all the time. Sure, her guardian angel would show up again and protect her from the big things, but from that point forward, she was a more interesting character that was willing to protect herself and those she cared for. Yes, it was also a highly traumatic moment that kind of didn't make sense, because you're talking about a young girl that not only had to kill a pedophile in self-defense, good for her, but she still killed a guy, and watch her pretty new adoptive mother figure die of a heart failure right in front of her. She just kind of bounced back from that and told her therapist that the world was slapstick. And I get that perspective, but she's a deeply traumatized young girl. And I just didn't, that's not a realistic, like I said, the book's not perfect. Despite its flaws, it's a fabulous book. But I think that wraps up what I wanted to talk about today. But if you like this video, please leave a like, if not a dislike, and let me know what some of your favorite moments in books were in the comment section below. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.